This is a Look Forward interview from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. I'm joined today by Tom de Vleesschauwer, Senior Director at S&P Global Mobility. We're going to be discussing an article Tom co-authored for our recent Look Forward series entitled The EV Revolution, Moving from the Oil Age to the Battery Age. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back here.
Tom, let's start with what you term the EV revolution. How big a change are we talking about, and how quickly will it come about?
Well, great. It's many things to cover there. EV revolution, I think it sort of became apparent to us when we were researching the article and coming to write it, that actually, if we're looking around the world, EV sales are really starting to pick up. I think we can genuinely refer to it as kind of an inflection point that we've arguably crossed already in quite a few markets. And that kind of made us sort of question internally also, clearly there are a lot of positives associated with that, but there's also a few potential negative or at least risks out there that we need to keep mind of. But just come back to the positive side really first. Everybody likes to hear positive news. The EV sales have really been driven by China, Europe, and to some degree the US. US still lagging behind a little bit more. People like to have their big internal combustion engines. But really before we talk about that, we should maybe make a quick reference to Norway, because Norway, it's an incredibly small market. But it's also a market that at the end of last year, 80% of all new vehicle sales were electric, pure electric. And that kind of sort of puts it in perspective, really. I mean, their ambition is by 2025 to reach 100% of all the vehicles being pure battery electric. And they are on track. They are probably the only country that's on track to any kind of these targets. But we can probably talk more about that later. I mean, as I said, volumes are relatively small. In Europe, I mean, things are going quite strong. And if I talk Europe, let's just maybe focus on Germany. Germany is the biggest market in Europe. And Germany had an incredibly good year when it comes to EVs. I think Germany was probably sort of trending in 2022 at around, I think it was about almost a third of the market that was pure battery electric. So, I mean, that's a big market. Good volume for Europe. It's also a lot of vehicle manufacturers, their home market there. And of course, there's a lot of other elements that come to stake with that. There's a lot of subsidy on the table, particularly for, to support the German vehicle manufacturing industry for that. So that does help. If you look at a market like, say, let's look at China. In China, I think we're talking about about a quarter of all the vehicles being pure electric. Now, China is the largest vehicle market in the world, so the volumes we're talking about is on a different scale altogether. We're talking, like 2 million or something like that. But you can kind of position it. And then in the US, when we look at the US, we're probably talking about, 8% or something like that. At this point, a lot of it dominated by Tesla. But the legislation is kind of put in place by President Biden now, particularly with the IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that sets it up quite nicely. We expect to have a fairly strong year, this year in 2023. So we could start to coin it as like it's really like a revolution that's happening, but there's a lot of danger associated with that too. Because if politicians hear that, it's a revolution, okay, we've done our job, we can, step away from this now. We've put a lot of money available on this sector. Every government needs more money right now, so let's spend that somewhere else. That is a very sensitive situation, but I'm sure we can talk more about that.
Let's talk some more about the U.S. where I live. As you and I have talked about before, I own an EV, but at present, when I drive down Highway 95, the major road between New York and Boston, there are about as many EVs as bright pink cars. When can I expect to see more EVs than internal combustion engines on the highway?
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, I think we'll probably see more EVs in urban environments because that's really still sort of the natural habitat, where they can help clean up the air that we breathe, all the other parts. On the highways, we'll probably, there will be increasing amount of EVs on there, obviously, soon. But EVs are still they have to drive at a slightly lower speed to maintain that range. All the other part, they need more frequent stops for charging. But that can be worked on, overall. But I think what you're really referring to is sort of that crossover point that we're talking about. And I would say we're not too far off from that. In one of our outlooks that we have to kind of look at how the future could evolve on this, we're talking about sort of probably that 2029 time frame when potentially the electric vehicles will cross over, from the internal combustion engine vehicles. And that's quite a huge achievement, really, particularly if you can imagine that, internal combustion engine vehicles globally, I mean, they account today for like a huge portion, probably like 80% or something like that. And for them to actually come down below in that sort of like, high 40% in that kind of time frame is, very significant. So that is truly, that symbolizes the EV revolution that, we are reaching that cutover point.
In your article, you point out that EVs are easier to manufacture. Why is that?
Well, I got to quantify that a bit better, I guess. If you look at an EV and you compare it to a conventional vehicle, I was going to say as we have, but you don't. So, they look size-wise all very similar, everything. They all have four wheels, but ultimately there's a lot more technology and componentry in there that makes the vehicle. And I hesitate to say it, but an EV has a significantly lesser amount of componentry in there. You say you live in the U.S. A U.S. vehicle, they're very big, they're very heavy. U.S. consumers like to have, big V6, V8 engines if they can, maybe even more than that. Those engines are incredibly complex to manufacture. Here in Europe or in Japan, there will be a lot less componentry in there compared to the US. But if we take it as an average, you could argue that an average internal combustion engine from all around the world, could have up to say like 2,000 components in there overall, which is quite significant. And if you're looking at an EV, you don't have any of those pistons moving in there. You have a driveline, all the other parts within there, which is super complex. So with an EV, you just need an electric motor, and there's not much in there. It all rotates the same. You just reverse the polarity, and then you can go forward and backwards. A couple of other parts. We don't have anything like that almost. So I would say on average, we could be looking at like 20 to 30 components that kind of move around in there. So that's a big difference. Now, is that easier to manufacture? I would say yes, but engineering it, I have heard from people in the industry that, yes, you might think that it is a lot easier to engineer and to manufacture all this, but there's a lot more often testing involved because there's new technology that we're not too familiar or skillful with. But overall, one could argue indeed that, yes, EVs are less complex, and that will potentially have a little sting in the tail at the end there, because in a conventional car factory, we have a lot of employees manufacturing vehicles there. And if we have to make them redundant, that could have significant political implications and social implications. So that's something that we are concerned about.
Battery metals really move to the forefront under this scenario. Who wins here with battery metals and who loses?
Okay, I never like to talk about winners and losers, but there's always someone who will do less,
yes.
Compared to before. It's as we say. We're moving away from an ecosystem where we have internal combustion engines and the barrel of oil takes center stage in there, right? The whole infrastructure, everything is there. Now we're moving to effectively a whole industry sectored or centered around a battery. And, they are very expensive pieces of technology that we have, energy storage systems. There's a lot of different chemistries that can go in there. There's a lot of precious metal content, all other parts. So there's still a lot that needs to be learned from it. And I think that who wins from it, well, we clearly have a few sort of more leaders for the moment in this sector that have more experience than others. But ultimately, it's all to do with if you look at the regulation that's pushing us, particularly in Europe, where they're saying on paper it's been signed in law that we have to be 100% battery electric vehicle for new vehicle sales by 2035. That's hugely ambitious if you're talking about a market where we're 14, 15, 16 million vehicles. If they all need a battery, that's a huge amount of these precious metals that we need to put in there. And the biggest concern is where can we get it, and who can supply it to us and it's not about just having the lithium, because everybody talks about lithium. Yes, there will be a lithium shortage of some sorts in the next couple of years. But the lithium, we can't just throw it in a battery. It needs to be refined, as we call it, or processed. So you need to have another step in there. And most people seem to kind of sort of ignore talking about that piece as well. So I think the big winners are going to be, I think, the processors, the refiners of those materials. Right now, today, the overriding majority are based in China. The lithium is also a lot of big hand in there from China, but a lot from Australia, Chile, a couple of other markets around the world. So you can start getting an idea really that the balance of power is going to significantly change. Who's going to be, I hate to say it, losers, but some of the manufacturers who were late to the party when it comes to switching over to EVs, they're saying, well, let someone else take that initial risk and create the market for these vehicles, and then we'll just kind of quickly, me too, we'll get in there. It might be that they might be a little bit late to the party to secure supply contracts for these. Now, eventually, the system might start balancing itself out. We can look at demand issues. If we start recycling batteries, that will help us. Now, if we don't immediately have much, of these mineral supply in Europe or in the US, there are a few places. I think Tesla has already kind of sort of staked its claim to quite a bit. In Canada, we have quite some supply. And actually, only about a couple of months ago, Sweden discovered a whole new, opportunity there with lots of supply availability. So the whole of Europe was kind of like, great, this is kind of saving us for the time being. But it will be, geopolitics will much more come to the forefront of this, and then we'll have to see.
Let's return to Norway, which you talked a little bit about. They've made a huge amount of money by drilling for crude oil. They also make money on petrol taxes. But as you say, they're on track for an EV conversion by 2025. How do they deal with that change from a tax, how does the sovereign wealth fund deal with that change? How are they going to move forward?
It's a great question, one which we already coined, I think, quite a while ago, and which we will go further on about in discussion with our clients. We're talking about Zero Week, come March this year. You're absolutely right to point out Norway is a special case. They are very wealthy. The sovereign fund there, really great. I mean, they're sitting on almost unlimited supply of oil and gas, which they can sell to the whole world, and they don't even use it themselves. So that's a big benefit for them. But even then, because they were so serious about let's make that conversion to EV, in order to do that, they basically threw out everything they had in terms to let's make this work. I mean, there's a smaller country. It's relatively easy to kind of set that up. There's only kind of sort of like 3 major cities in the country. We should also not ignore the fact that in Norway, because it is very cold winters, they had sort of like already an infrastructure around at people's houses or in their garages, what we call, I think, a block heater, which we also have in Canada and other states. where they had to plug in a heater just to keep the engine warm so you could start. So it's only there is some conversion involved in it, but to change that over to an EV charger is a lot easier to do because the groundwork is done with it. So that's kind of a big benefit for them. And then Norway really went all out and said, well, if you have an EV, you don't have to pay any tax on the car. You don't have to, obviously you're getting electricity, which is not taxed at this point, at least at home, other parts. So they're kind of doing a lot of extra stimulus out there to encourage people. And one of the very popular stimulus was that you were allowed to drive in the bus lane. So even though it's a small country, rush hour, everybody has some traffic congestion. So that was worth quite a bit to a lot of people. Now, in the end, the bus drivers in Oslo were complaining because they're saying, we're stuck in between cars in the bus lane. So ultimately now they have stopped that benefit and they're gradually kind of bringing down all the other benefits as well, just to kind of sort out the balance a little bit more because effectively everybody now is buying an EV. And it's kind of sort of, fortunately for Norway, is that more and more vehicle manufacturers are now actually pushing out new EV products. So there is more choice available for them too. So I think the direction is set and, there's almost no doubt in our mind that they will achieve that target, within the next 2 years. But so, yeah, if Norway can feel the reduction in fuel taxation, liquid fuel taxation, then we can only imagine what the pain would be for talking about the US or the UK or Germany or any other market around the world. So it's definitely something to keep track of.
Tom, we're talking about Norway, the success they've had there. We're talking about Sweden and their new sources of battery metals. Are we looking at a Viking revival?
I wish we could say maybe yes, because it would be good for the industry overall to have that revival of new materials and minerals. I'm not sure. It's a little joking, I guess, but why not? We have the industry is changing. And it's almost sort of like, we have to start setting new boundaries, new directions, and talking about reinventing itself, the industry itself. So
you say in your article that not all legacy car makers will make it through this transition necessarily. Who has put themselves in a good position for now?
Okay. Well, it's I think we mentioned too likely not all manufacturers will make it. It's hard to say because there's so many new startups. As we said, EVs are more easier to manufacture. So we get a whole bunch of new startup companies who kind of immediately go in there and going right. And actually what our research has shown, something we didn't mention in the paper, is that the majority of those startups actually never make it to production. So that, again, you can see that it's not just because it's easier to manufacture that everybody will make it. Now, who is best positioned in this? Well, I think we can't avoid mentioning Tesla in here. Of course, they were and still are today, among sort of the market leaders in there, rapidly expanding across the world. They've just had their German factory opened. They have a factory in China. They're building their third factory in the US. So there's a lot of growth momentum there. So they are, we can't ignore them. They definitely are in a very strong position. And then we have to sort of look at the usual suspects, I think. The bigger the manufacturer, the more likely that they will play a role of significance in the future. I don't mean necessarily that smaller manufacturers are by default they're not going to make it, because I think that's not true either. It's about the technology that people have, other parts. But I think one other thing that we shouldn't forget about is that is the end solution the pure battery electric vehicle? And that's kind of still the big question out there. Yes, in Europe, the regulation is set up that way now that effectively it would have to be, there is still an opportunity there for fuel cell vehicles. But in other markets around the world, I think specifically the US, you think about Japan, you think about other sort of leading automotive nations, that is not predetermined always. So there is still, opportunities for, other manufacturers that maybe have a strength in a different technology offering. So I think it would be, we should be careful not to discard some of these sort of like, some manufacturers would say they're the dinosaurs of the automotive industry. But, they have survived for that long because they are very quick in being able to adapt and know their market, understand what is required. So I think, we can't ignore, the bigger manufacturers, talking about, Volkswagen Group, talking about Toyota, talking about some of the, the big, large American manufacturers. We shouldn't underestimate them. And what we can see already today is that many of them are starting to have increasingly more levels of cooperation, with what could be regarded as their competitors. But also because they understand, well, you have a strength on fuel cell, I have a strength in this technology. Why don't we start doing something together? Because ultimately, money is finite in this industry, and cooperation is really, what helps with us. And the issue there then becomes, well, how does geopolitics get involved in this, all the other? But that's a different issue altogether.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Tom.
Thank you.
To read Tom's article on electric vehicles or the other articles in our Look Forward report, please look at the show notes. Thank you.